Ambassador Richard Hawthorne stepped out of his black diplomatic car, adjusting his expensive tie as he surveyed the imposing gates of Buckingham Palace. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard, where two royal guards stood at attention in their iconic red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats. Richard had been the American ambassador to the United Kingdom for only 3 months, but he already felt the weight of his position. His assistant, Margaret, hurried alongside him with a leather briefcase. "Sir, remember that today's meeting with the Foreign Secretary is quite important. The trade negotiations depend on making a good impression." Richard waved her off dismissively. "Margaret, I've been in diplomacy for 20 years. I know how to handle these situations." He straightened his shoulders and walked with the confident stride of a man who had never been told no. As they approached the palace entrance, Richard noticed the two guards standing perfectly still. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes fixed straight ahead. He had heard about these guards during his briefings, how they were trained to remain motionless for hours, never breaking character, never responding to tourists or visitors. "Impressive," he muttered to Margaret, "but everyone shows respect to diplomatic authority." The first guard, James Mitchell, had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 8 years. He had seen everything during his service. Tourists trying to make him laugh, children waving at him, even rude visitors attempting to provoke reactions. Today felt like any other day as he maintained his position. Though he noticed the approaching man's arrogant posture, Richard stopped directly in front of James, close enough that the guard could hear every word clearly. "Good morning, soldier," Richard announced loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Several tourists nearby turned to watch the interaction. James remained perfectly still, his training taking over. He had been taught that the Queen's Guard does not acknowledge casual greetings or engage with visitors unless there was a security threat. His eyes stayed focused on the distance, his breathing steady and controlled. "I said good morning," Richard repeated, his voice slightly sharper. Margaret shifted uncomfortably beside him, sensing that something was wrong with her boss's approach. The second guard, Thomas, stood 20 feet away and could see the entire situation developing. He recognized the signs of a confrontation brewing but maintained his own position. The royal guards were trained for exactly these moments. Richard's face began to redden as he realized the guard was not responding to his greeting. In his mind, this was a clear sign of disrespect. He had met with presidents, prime ministers, and royalty across the globe. No mere soldier had ever ignored him so blatantly. "Sir, perhaps we should proceed to the meeting," Margaret whispered urgently, checking her watch. "We're expected inside in 10 minutes." But Richard was not finished. His pride had been wounded by what he perceived as deliberate rudeness. He took another step closer to James, now standing just inches from the guard's face. "Do you know who I am, soldier?" Richard's voice rose to a near shout. "I am Ambassador Richard Hawthorne, representing the United States of America. I demand the respect that my position deserves." James could feel the man's breath on his face, but his expression never changed. His training had prepared him for far worse provocations than this. He had once maintained his position while a drunk tourist tried to climb on him. He had stood motionless during thunderstorms and blazing heat. One angry diplomat would not break his composure. The gathering crowd of tourists began pulling out their phones, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold. A few British visitors exchanged knowing glances, familiar with both the guard's duty and the growing reputation of the new American ambassador. Richard's anger reached a boiling point as he stared into James's unwavering face. The guard's complete lack of response felt like the ultimate insult to his authority and status. The tension in the courtyard thickened as Richard's frustration mounted. He had never encountered such blatant disregard for his diplomatic status. In his previous postings in smaller countries, local officials had always shown him immediate deference. This silent treatment from a mere guard felt like a personal attack on everything he represented. "This is unacceptable," Richard declared, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "I am here on official business, representing the United States government. The least you can do is acknowledge my presence with proper military courtesy." Margaret tugged gently at his sleeve, her face pale with embarrassment. "Ambassador, please. The Foreign Secretary is waiting, and we really should—" "No, Margaret," Richard cut her off sharply. "This is exactly the kind of attitude problem that undermines diplomatic relations. If their own guards don't show basic respect, how can we expect cooperation at the highest levels? James continued staring straight ahead, though he was acutely aware of every word being spoken. His fellow guard Thomas remained equally motionless at his post. Both men had received extensive training on dealing with difficult situations, and they knew that engaging with confrontational visitors would only escalate matters. A small crowd had gathered now, mostly tourists who had stopped to witness the unusual scene. Among them were several British citizens who understood the significance of the Royal Guard's duty and felt a growing sense of national pride watching James maintain his composure under pressure. Richard began pacing back and forth in front of the guard, his diplomatic training warring with his wounded ego. "You know what this is?" he asked loudly, addressing not just James but the entire gathering. "This is exactly why international relations suffer. Basic courtesy, basic human decency, apparently too much to ask for." An elderly British gentleman in the crowd shook his head disapprovingly. "Typical American," he muttered to his wife, just loud enough for others to hear. "Thinks the whole world should bow down to him." Richard's ears caught the comment, and his anger flared even higher. He was now fighting battles on two fronts, the unresponsive guard and the judgmental crowd. His face grew redder as he realized that his authority meant nothing in this moment. "Fine," Richard said, stopping directly in front of James again. "If you won't show proper respect voluntarily, then I'll have to demand it officially." He straightened his tie and assumed what he considered his most authoritative posture. Margaret closed her eyes, knowing that whatever came next would likely make headlines in the diplomatic community. She had worked for 3 ambassadors before Richard, and none of them had ever created such a scene over a simple protocol misunderstanding. James could sense the escalation building but remained committed to his duty. The Queen's Guard represented centuries of tradition and discipline. No amount of shouting or threats would make him break that sacred trust. His breathing remained steady, his posture perfect, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Thomas, meanwhile, was mentally preparing for the possibility that security might need to intervene. He could see palace security personnel beginning to take notice of the disturbance, though they had not yet approached. The situation was delicate. Involving a foreign diplomat meant that any response had to be carefully measured. "I want to speak to your commanding officer," Richard demanded. "This behavior is completely unacceptable, and I intend to file a formal complaint." "Do you understand me, soldier?" The crowd had grown larger, and several people were now recording the confrontation on their phones. Richard was too focused on his anger to notice that his diplomatic career might be about to take a very public and embarrassing turn. One young tourist from Germany whispered to her friend, "Is he seriously trying to start a fight with the Queen's Guard? Doesn't he know they're like statues?" But Richard was beyond caring about appearances or consequences. In his mind, this had become a matter of national honor and personal dignity that required immediate resolution. Richard's patience finally snapped completely. He had spent his entire career climbing the diplomatic ladder, earning respect through his position and title. The idea that a simple guard could ignore him so thoroughly felt like a direct challenge to everything he had worked for. "Soldier," he barked, using his most commanding voice, "I am Ambassador Richard Hawthorne of the United States of America. When a diplomatic representative approaches, you will render proper military honors. I demand that you salute me immediately." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The crowd that had gathered fell silent, sensing that something significant had just happened. Even the most casual observers understood that demanding a salute from the Queen's Guard was crossing a serious line. Margaret's face went completely white. She knew enough about royal protocol to understand that her boss had just made a potentially career-ending mistake. "Sir?" she whispered urgently. "Please, we really need to go inside now." But Richard was completely focused on James, waiting for the response he felt he deserved. He stood with his chest puffed out, chin raised, expecting the guard to finally acknowledge his authority with the proper military courtesy. James felt the weight of the moment, but never wavered. His training had covered exactly this type of situation. The Queen's Guard serves the crown, not foreign dignitaries, regardless of their rank or importance. Even if the President of the United States himself had demanded a salute, James would have remained motionless. A British Army colonel who happened to be visiting the palace had noticed the commotion and was now watching from a discreet distance. He recognized the delicate nature of the situation. A foreign ambassador making unreasonable demands of the Queen's Guard in full view of the public and media. Did he just demand a salute from the Queen's Guard? Asked a shocked tourist from Canada, loud enough for others to hear. He doesn't understand, replied an elderly British woman who had worked in government service for decades. The Guard doesn't salute anyone except members of the royal family and their direct commanding officers. It's been that way for centuries. Richard, overhearing these comments, became even more agitated. I don't care about your ancient traditions, he shouted. Diplomatic protocol supersedes local customs. This Guard will show me the respect I deserve, or there will be consequences. The situation was now completely out of control. What had started as a simple arrival at the palace had become a full-scale international incident, brewing in real time. Palace security was beginning to move closer. Though they were clearly uncertain about how to handle a confrontational foreign diplomat, James remained perfectly still. But inside he felt a deep sense of pride in his service and his country. He represented something much larger than himself. Centuries of British military tradition, the honor of the crown, and the dignity of his regiment. No foreign diplomat's tantrum would shake that foundation. Thomas, still maintaining his own position, was impressed by his colleagues' composure under such intense pressure. The training was working exactly as intended, but the situation was unlike anything either guard had experienced before. The crowd continued to grow, and the story was already beginning to spread on social media. People were posting videos with captions like "American ambassador loses his mind at Buckingham Palace" and "Entitled diplomat demands Royal Guard salute." Richard was completely oblivious to the damage he was causing to his own reputation and potentially to US-UK relations. His entire focus remained on forcing this one guard to acknowledge his authority, not realizing that he was fighting a battle he could never win. "This is your last chance, soldier," Richard said menacingly. "Salute me now, or I will make sure your superiors hear about this insubordination." The moment had arrived for James to demonstrate everything he had learned about duty, honor, and service to the crown. James Mitchell had reached the moment that would define not just his day, but potentially his entire career as a Queen's Guard. The angry American ambassador stood before him, demanding respect that was not his to command, while dozens of onlookers watched and recorded every second. For the first time since the confrontation began, James moved. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in his posture that indicated he was preparing to speak. The crowd held its breath, sensing that something important was about to happen. Richard's face lit up with triumph. Finally, he thought, the guard was going to show him the respect he deserved. He straightened his own posture, preparing to receive what he believed would be a proper military salute. But instead of saluting, James did something far more powerful. In a clear, calm voice that carried across the entire courtyard, he spoke words that would be remembered long after this day was over. "Sir," James said, his voice steady and respectful but firm, "I am a member of Her Majesty's Guard. I serve the crown and the crown alone. My salute is not mine to give to anyone except those who hold authority over me in this service. You may be an ambassador, but you are not my sovereign and you are not my commanding officer." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. The crowd was completely silent, processing what they had just witnessed. This was not the defiance Richard had expected. It was something far more sophisticated and devastating. James continued, his voice never wavering. "I mean no disrespect to you personally or to your great nation, but my duty, my oath, and my honor are pledged to something that exists beyond the politics of any single moment or any single person. I cannot and will not compromise that duty regardless of the consequences." Margaret felt a mixture of horror and admiration. Horror at what this meant for her boss's career, but admiration for the guard's principled stance. She knew she was witnessing something remarkable, a perfect example of duty and honor in action. The British Army colonel who had been observing stepped forward slightly, positioning himself where he could intervene if necessary, but he could see that James had handled the situation with exactly the right combination of respect and firmness. Richard's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. He had expected either compliance or simple defiance. Instead, he had received a masterclass in dignity and principle that left him completely speechless. Furthermore, James continued. If you wish to file a complaint about my conduct, you are certainly free to do so through proper diplomatic channels. My commanding officer will be happy to explain our protocols and the reasoning behind them. An elderly British gentleman in the crowd began to clap slowly. Others joined in, creating a wave of applause that washed over the courtyard. The tourists and locals were not just clapping for James, but for the principles he represented: duty, honor, and integrity in the face of unreasonable pressure. Richard finally found his voice, but it was much quieter now. This is unacceptable. There will be consequences for this. I understand, sir, James replied calmly. I am prepared to accept whatever consequences may come from doing my duty correctly. The crowd's applause grew louder. Someone shouted, "Well said, soldier." Another voice called out, "That's how it's done." Thomas remained at his post but felt an enormous surge of pride for his colleague. James had not only upheld their traditions but had done so with such grace and dignity that he had turned a potentially embarrassing situation into a triumph for their service. Richard looked around at the applauding crowd and began to realize, perhaps for the first time, how badly he had misread the situation. These people were not supporting him. They were celebrating the guard's refusal to bow to his demands. The weight of his mistake was beginning to sink in as phone cameras continued recording, and the story of his confrontation with the unshakable Queen's Guard spread rapidly across social media platforms worldwide. The applause continued for several more seconds before gradually dying down, leaving Richard standing in the courtyard feeling more isolated than he had ever felt in his life. The confident diplomat who had arrived just minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a man who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. Margaret seized the moment of quiet to step forward. "Ambassador," she said firmly, "we really must go to our meeting now. The Foreign Secretary has been waiting, and any further delay will create additional problems." But the damage was already spreading beyond the palace gates. Several tourists had posted videos of the confrontation on social media, and the story was beginning to go viral. The hashtag Queen's Guard Stand Strong was already trending, along with diplomatic disaster and respect the guard. A reporter from the BBC who had been nearby covering a different story had witnessed the entire confrontation. She was already on her phone with her editor, knowing that this would be front-page news by evening. "You won't believe what just happened at Buckingham Palace," she said quietly into her phone. James had returned to his original position, standing perfectly still as if nothing had happened. But the crowd was not ready to let the moment pass. Several people approached to thank him, though he did not acknowledge their words, maintaining his professional duty. Richard finally allowed Margaret to guide him toward the palace entrance, but his mind was racing with the implications of what had just occurred. He could already imagine the phone calls he would receive from Washington, the meetings he would have to endure, and the explanations he would need to provide. Inside the palace, word of the incident had already reached the Foreign Secretary's office. Sir William Thompson had been briefed on the situation and was now faced with the delicate task of conducting a diplomatic meeting with an ambassador who had just made international headlines for all the wrong reasons. "Good Lord," Sir William muttered to his aide. "How am I supposed to handle this?" The man just demanded a salute from the Queen's Guard in front of half of London. The aide, a career diplomat himself, shook his head. "I've never seen anything quite like it, sir." The guard's response was absolutely perfect, though. Firm but respectful, principled but not provocative. As Richard and Margaret made their way through the palace corridors, they passed several staff members who clearly knew what had just happened. The whispered conversations and sideways glances made it obvious that the story was already spreading throughout the building. Back in the courtyard, James continued his duty while tourists continued to take photos and videos. Many visitors who had witnessed the confrontation were now approaching the other guard, Thomas, trying to get him to break character as well. But Thomas remained as motionless as ever, having learned from James's example that their duty was bigger than any individual moment. The British Army colonel finally approached James's position. In a low voice that only the guard could hear, he said, "Well done, soldier. You've upheld the finest traditions of your service today." James gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible to anyone watching, but enough to acknowledge the compliment from a superior officer. Meanwhile, the story was already being picked up by international news outlets. CNN was preparing a segment on diplomatic protocol disasters, while The Guardian was crafting a piece about the unshakable dignity of the British Royal Guard. Richard finally reached the Foreign Secretary's office. But he knew that this meeting would be unlike any diplomatic encounter he had ever experienced. The trade negotiations he had come to discuss were now the least of his concerns. Sir William stood to greet them, his expression carefully neutral. "Ambassador Hawthorne," he said formally, "I believe we have quite a bit to discuss today. The real consequences of Richard's confrontation with the Queen's Guard were just beginning." The meeting with Foreign Secretary Sir William Thompson was unlike anything Richard had experienced in his diplomatic career. Sir William's typically warm demeanor was replaced by a cool professionalism that made the temperature in the room feel several degrees colder. "Ambassador," Sir William began, settling into his chair behind an ornate mahogany desk, "I understand there was quite an incident in our courtyard this morning." Richard tried to maintain his composure, but his earlier confidence had completely evaporated. "Sir William, I believe there was a misunderstanding about proper diplomatic protocol. Your guard seemed unaware of the courtesies typically extended to foreign representatives." Sir William raised an eyebrow. "I see. And in your country, Ambassador, do foreign diplomats typically demand salutes from your honor guards?" The question hung in the air like a sword. Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair, knowing that her boss was digging himself deeper into trouble with every word. That's different," Richard stammered. "Our Arlington Cemetery guards don't serve in the same capacity as your royal guards." "Indeed they don't," Sir William agreed. "Our guards serve the crown directly. They are not ceremonial decorations, Ambassador. They are active duty soldiers whose loyalty and salute belong to Her Majesty alone." Outside the palace, the story was exploding across social media platforms. The video of James's calm, dignified response to Richard's demands had been viewed millions of times within hours. Comments poured in from around the world, with overwhelming support for the guard's principled stance. "This is what honor looks like," wrote one user from Australia. "That guard just gave a masterclass in dignity and duty," posted someone from Canada. Even Americans were commenting in support of James, with many expressing embarrassment about their ambassador's behavior. Back at the guard barracks, James's commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, was fielding calls from journalists, palace officials, and even members of Parliament. The story had grown far beyond a simple diplomatic incident. "Guard Mitchell," Colonel Harrison said when James reported for debriefing after his shift, "You've certainly made an impression today." "Sir, I simply followed my training and upheld my oath," James replied. "Indeed you did, and you did it with such dignity that you've reminded the entire world what our service means. Well done." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the State Department was scrambling to manage the fallout from Richard's actions. Secretary of State Patricia Williams was in emergency meetings, trying to figure out how to address the situation without further damaging U.S.-UK relations. How did he think demanding a salute from the Queen's Guard was appropriate? She asked her staff. Has he never read a protocol manual? Has he never studied British customs? The answer, unfortunately, was becoming clear. Richard's arrogance had blinded him to basic diplomatic knowledge that any first-year embassy intern would have understood. Back in London, Richard's phone was buzzing constantly with calls from Washington. Each conversation was more difficult than the last, as his superiors tried to understand how such a seasoned diplomat could make such a fundamental error. "Ambassador," came the voice of Deputy Secretary Johnson over the secure line, "I need you to explain to me how you thought this was appropriate behavior." Richard found himself without good answers. His wounded pride and sense of entitlement had led him to make demands that no foreign diplomat had the right to make. The guard's response had not only been correct, it had been a perfect example of how to handle such an inappropriate request. Sir William concluded their meeting with words that would haunt Richard for the rest of his career. "Ambassador, I hope you understand that today's incident has created significant complications for our bilateral relationship. Your conduct toward one of our guards was not just inappropriate. It demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of sovereignty and respect." As Richard left the palace, he noticed that James was still at his post, still standing with perfect posture, still embodying the dignity and honor that Richard had failed to show. The crowd around the guard had grown even larger, with people from around the world making special trips to see the guard who had stood up to diplomatic bullying. The irony was not lost on Richard. In trying to demand respect, he had lost it completely, while the guard who had refused his demands had earned the admiration of millions. 3 weeks later, the full consequences of that morning at Buckingham Palace had reshaped multiple lives and careers. Richard Hawthorne sat in his now empty embassy office, packing the last of his personal belongings into cardboard boxes. His recall to Washington had been swift and decisive. The State Department's investigation had been thorough and damaging. Richard's pattern of arrogant behavior toward local officials in previous postings had finally caught up with him. The incident with the Queen's Guard had been the final straw that broke his diplomatic career. 20 years of service, he muttered to himself, placing a framed photo of his swearing-in ceremony into a box, all destroyed by one moment of pride. Margaret, who had been reassigned to work with the incoming ambassador, stopped by to wish him well. "Sir, if it helps, I think you were a good diplomat in many ways. This one incident doesn't erase everything else you accomplished." Richard looked up at her, his face showing a humility that had been completely absent 3 weeks earlier. "Margaret, I've had a lot of time to think about what happened. That guard was right and I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong." Meanwhile, James Mitchell had become something of a celebrity, though he handled the attention with the same quiet dignity he had shown that morning. Interview requests poured in from around the world, but he politely declined them all through his commanding officer. "I was simply doing my duty," he told Colonel Harrison. "I don't need recognition for that." But recognition came anyway. The video of his calm, principled response had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. Military academies were using it as a teaching tool about honor and duty. Leadership experts were writing articles about his example of grace under pressure. Queen Elizabeth herself had privately commended James's conduct, and rumors circulated that he might receive special recognition for his service. More importantly to James, his fellow guards respected how he had upheld their traditions without creating an international incident. The story had become a case study in diplomatic schools around the world. Professor Sarah Chen at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service now used the incident as a prime example of how cultural misunderstanding and personal arrogance can destroy diplomatic relationships. Hawthorne's demands were not just inappropriate, she explained to her students. They revealed a fundamental failure to understand that diplomacy requires humility and respect for local customs and sovereignty. In Britain, James had become a symbol of quiet strength and principled service. Tourist visits to Buckingham Palace had increased significantly, with many people specifically hoping to see the guard who stood up to the American ambassador. The British public had embraced James as a hero, not for any dramatic action but for his calm refusal to compromise his principles. Social media was filled with messages of support and admiration for his conduct. Richard's replacement, Ambassador Sarah Martinez, made her first official visit to Buckingham Palace exactly 1 month after the incident. As she approached the gates, she saw James at his post and made a mental note of the profound dignity with which he carried himself. Instead of demanding anything, Ambassador Martinez simply nodded respectfully as she passed. James, following protocol, did not acknowledge her greeting, but she understood and respected the boundaries of his duty. Later, Ambassador Martinez met with Sir William Thompson, who had recovered his warm demeanor now that diplomatic relations were back on solid ground. "Ambassador Martinez," Sir William said, "I hope we can build a more understanding relationship than we had with your predecessor. Sir William, I've studied the incident thoroughly. I can assure you that respect for British sovereignty and customs will be the foundation of my service here." The story of Richard's demands and James's response had become legendary, but perhaps the most important outcome was the renewed appreciation for the principles both men represented. One who had forgotten his duty to diplomacy and respect, and another who had never wavered from his commitment to honor and service. James continued his duties at Buckingham Palace, standing guard with the same quiet dignity that had made him famous. He never spoke publicly about that morning, but his actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. The lesson was clear to everyone who heard the story. True respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned through character, integrity, and understanding, qualities that James had demonstrated perfectly and Richard had abandoned completely in one fateful moment outside the palace gates.